right, here we go. It's another episode. It's Film Streak. I'm watching new films, and these are films that are sometimes brand new, sometimes in theaters, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're much older and much less known, more obscure, maybe just weird. And this episode, it's going to be a lot of that. It's going to be a whole lot of what the hell am I watching? And that's all right. You know, that's part of the fun of this sometimes. It's part of the challenge even, because some of these films aren't necessarily easy or entertaining to sit through. But that is ultimately the goal, is to just expand the horizon, see some things you've never seen, maybe some things you didn't really think you wanted to see. But follow a train of thought, follow a genre, follow a filmmaker, and see where it takes you, you know? So, I did an episode a while back talking about films from like the 70s and 80s, like A Boy and His Dog and Death Race 2000. And, some of these films from that era, which I think culminated in Mad Max. And that, I think, kind of set the bar. And everybody else kind of got in line and said, oh, we're making something like that. And part of that was a little bit, I was going back to those films because I was kind of leading myself up to Furiosa, right? Which I ended up talking about, had my feelings about it, enjoyed some of it, wasn't really hyped about other parts of it. But it made me kind of think back on those films from that period, from the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, where you saw a real run of filmmakers trying to mine that territory, that I guess it's a genre of itself, right? The post-apocalyptic setting, the dystopian world or society where things are falling apart or there are no more rules and everything goes. And you've seen it done in very serious, very grounded ways. I guess for me, probably the most intense or the most, the most somber version is probably The Road. And then you have other stuff like, the Mad Max franchise, of course. But I found there is a whole lane in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s that is about not so much telling something new or original, but just revisiting that whole genre and trying to find something. And look, I'm not saying these films are going to be great. I'm probably telling you now they're not great. But something to keep in mind, because I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I was talking to a good friend about this era of films and specifically this genre and how, for as much as you may or may not enjoy films like these, they're still work. So I'm just going to run through some of the titles here. If we say something like, let me see, what's the earliest film that I saw here? There's Stryker from 1983, Wheels of Fire from 1985, The Sisterhood from 1988. There's, let's see, what else do I have? I know Dune Warriors from 1991. There's Equalizer 2000. There's, let's see, is there another here? Do I have another one on my list? Actually, this one's a more recent one, I guess. It's called Future World from 2018. And what I really did was I looked at these films and I said, wait, they all kind of seem to be telling the same type of story. There's a main character and there's this post-apocalyptic setting. And there's this struggle for either power or resources, or, specifically water. It seems to be the thing. And it's not always established or clear of like what the end result is going to be, like other than to just survive, right? So watching these films, one, I kind of had to back off of any expectations, right? You kind of have to do that. These aren't even like B movies. You're talking about the production quality. You're talking about the acting. You're talking about the writing. There's so much of this that is not on par with anything that would probably see today, other than, unless you're just like bombing around Tubi and looking at what's on there, you probably see the modern day equivalent. And that's why one of these films is a more recent film. But a lot of these, it's very clear they were inspired by films like A Boy and His Dog, by Mad Max, and they take on a lot of those characteristics, but I don't know if they just don't seem self-aware, you know? And I think that's something, if you're making a film like this, you kind of have to be aware and acknowledge what you are and what you're doing. Let the audience in on the joke, so to speak. And I think that's where George Miller with Mad Max has kind of done that. He knows these films that he makes are basically pretty ridiculous, but they are also trying to say something, whether it's about the characters and their struggle, or it's about like the world in general and the state of the world, and maybe kind of predicting or warning us about where things might go one day. You know, there are themes like that in his films. And yet they can still take a step back and just say, look, isn't this crazy? Isn't this weird? And kind of laugh at themselves in a way. Let the audience in. A lot of these films that I'm talking about here, though, I think they took a different angle of like, there's no wink to it. There's no kind of, maybe one of these films has it, but otherwise they are trying too hard, and they're trying too hard with not a lot to work with. And I'll say, I mean, as I was watching some of these films, I started to see a through line. And what it was is a specific filmmaker who was behind a few of these films. His name is Cirio Santiago. And so he's a filmmaker who worked throughout the era of like blaxploitation films. He also did a series of Vietnam War films, you know, that era from the 70s into the 80s. And this was another kind of lane that he found of like these post-apocalyptic sort of Mad Max knockoff stories. And I can't say any of these films are actually good or even great, of course, but there is something fascinating about seeing a filmmaker really kind of come back to the same well, trying to find another angle on the same story, you know, or the same type of characters. And all of these films that I mentioned, and let me see, if I actually count them out here, you know, if I say, let's start with Stryker, 1983, Wheels of Fire, we've got Equalizer, 2000, we've got the Sisterhood, we've got Dune Warriors. That's 5 films right there. And for the most part, all 5 of those films are basically the same film. Essentially, right? And it's curious, I mean, because there are differences, there are different characters, and there are different, I guess, plot devices that are used, and a couple of different themes, I guess, that float around between them, but they are basically the exact same film. They follow the same structure, they have the same bones, right? So it just made me think of like, okay, what's the idea here? Is the idea is like just crank out material and maybe something sticks, and maybe not all of it's great or even of any quality, but it's at least there. Maybe. I mean, this is a filmmaker who is no longer with us, passed away in 2008, and has a pretty significant body of work. I mean, we're talking about over 100 films by my count, by what I see here on IMDb. And yet in this period between, 83 and 91, and there are even a couple others that I didn't get to. And you know what? It's funny, also kind of delved into like the women in prison genre, strangely enough. Maybe that's another episode someday. I don't know. This is interesting, you know, because it's like, this is not the only filmmaker, of course, that made these types of films in that period, but the fact that this guy kept coming back to the same thing over and over, I had an immediate interest. And so anyway, so as I'm watching these films, I'm kind of trying to understand, just trying to grasp like what the idea is. And it's funny when you watch films out of context, you know, in a different time period than when they were made, and you look at the subject matter, you look at the premise, and maybe it's relevant, but maybe in a different way, or maybe it's just not relevant at all anymore. And so you try to find some way to appreciate it, even if it's just for like the kitsch factor or just the campiness or the cheesiness of it, you know? And these films, I got to say, like, I couldn't really enjoy them on a real, like, substantial level. I didn't find them all that engaging, honestly. The stories are kind of repeating the same tropes and cliches of the genre. But I did at least try to look at it in terms of like, oh, well, they're at least doing something. They're at least doing work and producing something that can stand the test of time. And it kind of took me back to the thought of just filmmaking itself, you know? Like, to see these films, and so I also caught a lot of these on either like Tubi or what's the other one? Like Pluto or one of those other, you know, where you can watch them for free. And I think Tubi is really the place actually, because they have a lot of obscure stuff. They have a lot of stuff from Shout, a lot of really hard to find, just rare, almost like out of print stuff. You can find it there. And so these films, just digging in and just going down the rabbit hole and watching these, you know, these films aren't deep on story, but you have to remember, it's like, they're still there. Like, making a film isn't easy. And especially, you know, the idea of like making these on film. It's not like today, right? You can shoot these digitally. You can just run and run and run. And technology and equipment is so much easier to work with and faster to work with. No, these people were shooting on film with like real ass cameras and all the equipment needed. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work now, but it was even more work back then. And so to think, well, look, all these films, and this goes across the board, of course, any films throughout history, it's like they take a real concerted effort and blood, sweat, and tears to get it done. And so, you know, just appreciate it on that level of like these films, they're there and you can enjoy them in some way. So to kind of just get into the films a little bit, I guess, I mean, Stryker from 1983. I mean, it's about a character who is in this post-apocalyptic setting. He's involved in this fight for control of water. Specifically, right? I think that is the main thing that a lot of these films hinge on. It's funny, Mad Max never really did that. It was all about the gasoline, right? It was all about fuel because of the engines, right? Because of that's what the machine is that the world relies on. But these films, there are cars and there are these weird vehicles and there are weapons and all that. But the main thing people are concerned about is water. It's like, hey, what about making bullets? Or what about making more gas, you know? But no, water is the thing. That is the key to survival, I suppose. So it is about this character involved in this fight between these different factions. And it's a lot of pretty plain, pretty basic action scenes and shootouts and, you know, battles. And it's not that interesting. The acting isn't great in any of these. Something that is interesting, though, is I think this might be the first film that I would say, and I guess I could look in IMDb, but I think this might be the first time we see Robert Patrick on screen, for whatever that's worth. This is an actor who still works today and still works in top quality material, but I think most audiences probably first saw him in either Terminator 2, or maybe you caught a glimpse of him in Die Hard 2. But he had been working for years before that, all the way back to the early or mid 80s, and with this director in these films. And so I just think that's an interesting little nugget of trivia of like, you know, here's an actor who has had a long and varied career on film and in television. And he got his start in this really low rent B movie or C movie territory, working with Roger Corman, working with Cirio Santiago, working on these post-apocalyptic films. And I don't know, that was an interesting thing to see, like in one of the first scenes of one of these movies. It's like, wait, that's Robert Patrick. And he's like super young. And we get to Wheels of Fire in 1985. And that's the one of these films that I'm talking about that I feel like in the moment must have felt like a big deal. Like, oh, here's one that's going to transcend. This one's going to like break out, you know? Because look, when you watch the film, first thing you see, there's a Columbia logo at the front. This is a film that was distributed by a major studio. So, oh, wow, okay. So you kind of grind away doing these, trying to make it work, and then you get like some big action on one, right? But again, once you watch the film itself, it's like, it's not really there, you know? And you can say that about a lot of films from the 80s. It's like they were trying a lot of things. It was a lot of trial and error, especially in like science fiction and action. It wasn't what it is today. It wasn't as refined. It wasn't as polished. It wasn't as slick. It was a miracle to even get it done. So in this film, you've got the main character is a guy who is involved in this, again, like a struggle for power between different factions. His sister gets kidnapped. And for most of the film, she's just rocking with the yeets out, you know? And it's like, oh, that's kind of different. And look, you got to keep that in mind. Films of this era, the 70s into the 80s, it was a lot of that. It was a lot of like, this is an excuse to get some naked girls in the movie, right? And I mean, you saw it across comedies, you saw it across dramas, and not even like high-end or, you know, studio releases, but like even the lower grade stuff. Because I think that was a period where you had major releases, you know, that were hits and all that. And they didn't really go there. And then you had the films below that, like the B grade, the lower budget films that they weren't afraid to go there. And then you had films below that were, you know, just really obscure and pretty small budget, usually very independent. And that was like, it was almost like a requirement. It's like, I got to have some nudity in this film. That's the only way I'm going to get people to watch it. And so a lot of times you could see it where these films, like they were just kind of excuse to get some naked girls on screen. And even if it's, you know, if we're talking about comedies, like something like, not even like stuff like Risky Business or Revenge of the Nerds or not even those. I'm talking about stuff like Hard Bodies or stuff like Hots, right? You know what I'm talking about. And look, you even got, and I'm on this track too, of sword and sorcery fantasy genre too. Beastmaster and, you know, films like that where, so, you know, it is interesting though to watch this film, Wheels of Fire, where this actress, and I don't remember her name, but plays the sister of the main character, like for most of the film, just no top. And it's about him trying to get his sister back to rescue her. And then the battle to like regain power and all that. It's a lot. After that, you've got Equalizer 2000, which again, it's more of this wasteland warfare kind of deal. And, you know, it is one of those where as I'm watching it, honestly, like some of the props in it look like they were just leftovers from Wheels of Fire. One, because I know it's the same filmmaker, but also like it looks like even like the same sets and it's the same kind of vibe. But it really does kind of just retread the same ground. Like it's not about a guy with a sister gets kidnapped, but it is again about, you know, people fighting for water, fighting for whatever, fighting for power. And it gets kind of boring, honestly. But that is a part of it, I think. Is like we're kind of going through the motions, but we're just trying to see what we can get out of it. And so once we get to The Sisterhood, 1988, here's a film that it's about two female warriors, but they also use magic. And they're in this post-apocalyptic world again. And they're kind of taking on the different factions there. And it's also a dynamic between like the men involved in this, and they are, kind of asserting their power and dominance and fighting and standing up for the women who are kind of getting run over by the situation. And so I guess, if anything, this is the film that has a little more to say. It's got a little more of a direct point that it's trying to make. And yet it does still kind of work in the same vein. And the fact that magic comes into play, I mean, it's like, why are you trying to pull two different things off? Stick with the Wasteland thing, make that work. Let's not add magic and visions and this kind of supernatural element to it. I think that's where it kind of goes astray, The last one here, well, let me see. Is this the last one? Not quite, but it's close. Dune Warriors from 1991. Yeah, this one was interesting because if you look at like the poster or you just read about it, it's got David Carradine in it. And in 1991, I had to stop and think for a second. Like, what did I know, or where did I kind of place David Carradine in 1991? It was before the time where we saw an actor with his history really kind of transition from like low grade, B movie type stuff into top tier appearances, And so I don't know if David Carradine was one of those actors that ever really did move from that B-level film into truly like, I don't know, like say high-minded prestige filmmaking or stories, right? I mean, nothing's coming to mind, unfortunately, I guess. But, I did talk about in the previous episode about these types of films. In Death Race, I'm like, here's a guy who has a presence and definitely made a mark for himself and went on to do other kinds of films. Put it this way, like David Carradine, I don't think was ever in the running for any Oscars, And yet people knew who he was. And maybe that was even from TV, from Kung Fu. Maybe that was from his other films. I know almost like a staple when I was growing up, here in Texas at least, was Lone Wolf McQuade. And of course, that's a Chuck Norris film, but David Carradine is the bad guy in that film, and he is like a badass bad guy. He's like a guy you don't mess with. Only Chuck Norris would mess with, And so once you get into the film, you kind of see like, oh, well, it is still kind of the same thing. It's post-apocalypse setting. It's these groups of people fighting over water again. And the rest of the acting, I mean, the rest of the cast, it's real basic, like TV acting. Like there are a couple of characters or actors that bring something to it. But a lot of the performances here, it's like, I don't even know if these people were actors. And aside from that, of course, the production, it's low rent. It's nothing remarkable. And so that's where I was like, well, damn, even a star or a notable lead in the film just really can't make this work. And it's not to say like the types of stories are bad, but it reminded me of this. Put it this way. All of these films, really, it reminded me that making a film, telling a story on film, it really is a group effort. Like you can't have just a notable name, and you can't just have somebody with talent at the wheel, and you can't just have maybe a talented writer, to kind of kick off the idea. You've really got to have all of those things, but then you've also got to have a full like cast and crew that has talent, has skill, and can all bring their skills and talent to make this vision become reality. Because all it takes is like, well, a director who has an idea and has the conviction to do it, but the writing's not good, the acting might not be good, maybe the production quality, you know, the different departments just aren't up to snuff for this kind of vision. Okay, that's the thing. These films aren't about like, you know, people sitting in the kitchen talking about, you know, hard times. This is like full-on productions. Like they're out in the desert or out in wherever they are, and they've got all these weird cars and weapons and explosions and all these funky costumes and all these sets that they're on. So it's like everybody's got to be just banging it out on all cylinders, right? You can't have anybody slacking. And so that's where I feel like in order to do this kind of stuff right and make it, not only make it successful, because that's kind of subjective, right? But I just mean make it good, make it of significance. It takes everybody. It takes the full production to go at their hardest. And of course, these films, look, I mean, these films were made a long time ago. It's not to say people didn't try. You know, I think that's the thing I always try to keep in mind, even on, you know, little things that I've done. It's like nobody sets out to make anything bad necessarily. Maybe if you're Ed Wood, I guess, but nobody sets out to make a bad film or tell a bad story or tell it in a bad way. But sometimes it's just how it happens, and you're kind of at the mercy of whatever or whoever you're working with, right? And so that's where I cut it slack. You know, I cut these films and films of this era, or any era really, throughout film history. I cut them some slack because it is hard work. I mean, watching a bad movie that's made today, bad movies today are easy. It's easy to make a bad movie today. I mean, you don't got to try at all. Just point a camera at something and call it a movie. You may think it's good, or somebody may be telling you it's good, but that's where you get the real distinction between who knows what they're doing and who just wants to do it. And yet, you know, if you look at films that were made in the past on film, oh, those movies, they might be bad too in your eyes or in someone's eyes, but those were still hard. Those were not easy. And so that's where I think it's an interesting dynamic to look at, of like a movie you might enjoy, but you might not recognize it as an actual like quality movie. There's still room in there to appreciate the work that went into it and the effort. And that brings me to the last movie I want to talk about here, which, it's not from this filmmaker, Cirio Santiago. It's not from this era. It's a film that's much more recent. It's from 2018. And it's a film called Future World. And it's not, I know there is the old film Westworld, and there's a sequel to that called Future World. It's not that film. That was from, what was that, the 70s or whatever. This film, it stars, who's in it? It's like Mia Jovovich is in this. James Franco is in this. There's like a couple of other people you might or might not recognize. I don't know. But it's kind of a similar thing. Post-apocalyptic setting. And there are these different people, these different groups that are fighting. And there's this one character that is, I suppose, like an android, like a cyborg. And James Franco, his character, takes this, I guess, woman, this being, like as his wife in a way. And then it's like she kind of does her own thing. And so then there's like this struggle between them. And then this other group comes into it. And there's, here's the thing. This to me was the example of like, this shows you how easy it is to make a bad movie now in more recent times. Because this is like the writing, I mean, even aside from the filmmaking, but the writing of it, the tone of it, I mean, even the performances, it's just all over the map. It's like everybody's in a different movie in this thing somehow. Like there are some moments where it's very serious and earnest and it feels kind of somber because of the setting or because of the situation that the characters are in. But then other moments where it's almost like cartoonish and it kind of plays on some cliches and tropes of this genre. And I'm guessing it's supposed to be like a really dynamic blend of all of those things, right? Like we're giving you the roller coaster. You're going here, you're going there, you're going up, you're going down. But as a whole, watching it never really comes together. And it just feels like I'm just hit with the thought of like, what is this? Like who put this together? Who thought this was the way this would make an interesting story? Because it's not confusing, but it is just puzzling. And the only thing I could kind of try to make sense of it with was by thinking, wait a minute, is this film, and maybe this is just me being like super forgiving, but is this film in some way like an homage to those films from past eras, from like the 70s, 80s, these other films I just talked about? Is this supposed to be sort of like a throwback to those films? Because it kind of feels like it. And yet you've got some people in here who are recognizable, who are known actors, known faces. And so you assume, oh, it's going to bring a certain quality to it. But it really doesn't. It doesn't really get us there. And the tone, it feels sort of like those older films. Like it's not really sure what it's doing. And now you could just say, hey, it's a bad film. Get over it. Don't overthink it, right? I understand that. Believe me, I've tried to think through like, why are these bad films and why do they exist? And you could say, well, hell, somebody wants to make money, so they're going to make a film and try and make money off of it. My experience is like, that's not how filmmaking works necessarily. I couldn't imagine anybody would say, I'm going to make this movie to make money. I come back to, well, this must be somebody trying to express something, trying to figure out something, trying to tell a story and make it say something, make it matter, right? And look, in that regard, I think all these films really don't do that. I guess they kind of fail in that way. But I think looking back now, you can look at them kind of out of context or with a new perspective. And you could say, oh, this was just something that was in the air at the time. You could say whether it was like fears of like nuclear holocaust or like world war or like drought or famine or disease, all those kind of global fears that I guess permeate any given moment. Look, we just went through a pandemic a couple of years ago, and how many films coming out of that have we seen that have in some way or another worked in infections or viruses or just straight out like pandemics? You could say, well, there were films before that. Yes, of course. There's Contagion. There's, all these other films from years before. And maybe they kind of predicted where we might go, what might happen one day. But then once it happened, now we had a whole new perspective on it. We could tell stories from real experience, right? And so I kind of feel like that's where a lot of these films come from. I think that's something that George Miller himself even said, is like there was a sort of streak of inspiration for Mad Max that came out of the oil crisis in the late 70s. I've seen the tinges of people almost kind of halfway losing their shit because there's no gas. And what does that turn into? Where would society go if things like that, resources started to break down? And so I guess you could say, well, maybe there was just a bigger fear around the world of that. And so maybe George Miller was the one to really capitalize on it and make it into something great. But other people probably felt it too, or saw the same inspiration and tried to do their own thing. I don't know. It's curious. It just fascinates me, you know? It's like the films of the 50s. And you could see how they were all inspired by like the Red Scare. And I think you could even say that about films from like the 2000s and, you know, the years after 9/11, and how they sort of in their own ways tried to address that kind of thing, that kind of either that kind of event, that kind of catastrophe, or that kind of fear and paranoia. So anyway, that's a big kind of high-minded way to look at some of these films that just probably aren't that good in the grand scheme of things, but they are there and they exist. And I think that's one of the interesting things about film is that your work, your story, your idea can live on. It can stand the test of time. Whether people find it or not, maybe that's a different story, but it is there. It's in the books. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Have you seen some of these films? These films are very niche, very narrow window from a very specific point in time for the most part. So is that something that you recognize? Have you seen these films? If you haven't seen these films, I don't know if I'd really suggest these. Maybe just as a curiosity, maybe you would check them out and see what's going on there. They're a little rough to sit through, you know? They kind of grind away at you for a little bit. But that's part of the mission here at Filmstreak is got to watch the films. You got to see what's up, what's going on here. Part of it's curiosity. Part of it is just like, can I even do it? And I guess I did it, for now at least. So anyway, that's it. Here we go. On to the next episode. We'll talk to you next week or so. And hey, summer's almost over. So let's look forward to some cool weather, right? Maybe a little rain, maybe a little, hey, how about no more hurricanes, you know? So, all right, that's it for me. You take it easy, have fun, go watch something new.